At this point, I would like to open the debate to the floor. I took a quick lesson from Josue on how to manage this process, and so I will adopt his practice of starting on the right side of the room, moving from front to back, then the center front to back, and then your left front to back. So a quick couple of rules. Please introduce yourself. Please keep your question focused without too much of an elaborate introduction so that plenty of people have the opportunity to pose questions, and indicate whether you wish to direct your question to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. So the floor is open. So I have one person on my right at the back, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Mauli Sabla. I think I did introduce myself. I work for FAO Regional Office for Africa. This is not to belabor the point or the question I asked earlier on. But I think that it's very important for us to begin to reflect on how we engage the private sector in these processes of increasing urbanization and shifting trends and dietary transition, and how we regulate them and spell out clearly the rules of engagement. And I think that countries would have to really find a way of understanding how we position ourselves in terms of developing standard regulatory frameworks and how we enforce their compliance. And I'm not sure who to direct the question to, but it could go as an open question to all the panelists, depending on who is more comfortable in responding to it. How do we support countries in that process of positioning themselves for standard setting, for enforcement and compliance within the food system?
Thank you. Very relevant. One campaign.
Hi, I guess I don't need to introduce myself, but this question is to all the panel. Noting the fact that it was meant to be all male, I want to ask a question about gender. So we know that women consistently have lower access to productive resources than men, despite the fact that they represent about 50% of the agricultural labor force. So when we're talking about remunerative employment and wage employment in the ag sector, we have to talk about gender and women. So my question is basically in both extension and research and development, what specific actions can we take to ensure that we're not paying just lip service to gender employment in agriculture? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving to the center now, there's a gentleman at the front.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Malam Shtai from IGAT. I have 2 points. One is the food production versus food consumption. Really, I fully agree with David, which he elaborated on the availability of unhealthy foods. My concern is here also the issue of food waste, especially in the urban areas where it becomes a significant challenge. Really, I think, should it be an issue of talk for the day? This is one point. The other point, probably to Moses or Farah, with regard to the agricultural production and enhancing the productivity of the agricultural production, there are 2 scenarios: conservation agriculture and intensification. Which way forward to feed the African continent? We are preaching both sides without talking about their pros and cons. Really, I appreciate the importance of science and technology, definitely, to enhance the productivity. On the other hand, we are also preaching a conservation agriculture to deal with. Which way forward to be an African to full food self-sufficiency at the continent level? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in the center, your one question, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Roman Marumero from Malawi. My question goes to my colleague from Zambia. I think you have talked quite well in terms of the conservation agriculture, the minimum tillage. But the debate when it comes to conservation agriculture, in line with the topic we are discussing is finding the nexus between various policies. For example, land degradation policies, livestock production policies, and food security policies. What's the experience in Zambia in finding the nexus among these policies? Because sometimes they contradict each other or they do not support each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Was there another question from the center? At the front, please?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Emmanuel Mhozi from Ministry of Agriculture, Uganda, and my question goes to Flora. From the presentation we had with the Lula, we've seen that actually the number of youth comprises of or makes up the biggest proportion of our population in Africa. And for instance, in Uganda, we see people moving away from the villages, most especially the youth, to engage in driving what we call famously as borders. And this comes with a number of problems into the cities and other areas. So my question is, how can we gainfully engage these youth in agriculture in regard to agribusiness development and investment? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. So turning to the left side, the gentleman in the white top.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is David Adama. I work with ActionAid International. My question is first to Malawi, in terms of the issues, the land reforms that are happening, in terms of how are consultations happening, and the issue of prior informed consent, engaging the people who are supposed to be part of this process. And then the issue of consultation with the appropriate stakeholders. That's one for Malawi. We would need to know that. And then my second is to Moses. Moses talked about that NGOs are promoting inappropriate technologies. And I think it would be right to look at what are these technologies that are inappropriate. It means that there are no consultations, there are no partnerships, there are no engagement with the civil society and the farmers. Because if you're saying that CSOs are promoting inappropriate technologies and the farmers are accepting these technologies, it means it's working for them. And that's possibly why they're accepting it as it's being promoted. So we need to be very clear on why are we saying these technologies are inappropriate. And it goes to the question he talked about, we're preaching one and two sides of this whole way of tackling food security and encouraging business and wealth creation for farmers. So there has to be that balance for us to be able to say this is what is appropriate and this is what is not appropriate. And what has government done in Zambia to be able to say these technologies are not appropriate, these are the appropriate technologies. And where were those technologies that have been said appropriate, have been tested to say they are appropriate over the inappropriate technologies that have been that the civil society are promoting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. A very valid concern. Ethiopia.
Thank you. I'm Ethiopia from Addis Ababa University. My question is to David. David, in situations whereby we enjoyed better productivity and increase in production, we don't see a positive correlation in improved nutrition, because even when farmers' income is increasing, their priority might be changing their cottages to houses covered by iron sheets, buying television, mobile phones, and the like. So what should be done in creating the consumption culture so that, smallholder farmers can benefit in improving nutrition from the income that is generated through increasing productivity? Thank you.
One last question, or actually two, three. Gentlemen at the back, and then I'll catch the two near you. Please be
Thank you.
brief.
My name is Richard Mambia from Zimbabwe. My question is to Flora. I just want to find out how are they balancing the issue of land displacements for smallholder farmers and huge private sector investments, especially in the issue of sugarcane plantations, because I have seen it in Zimbabwe, and also issue of huge dam constructions. How are they balancing the issue of people's livelihoods and the private sector development?
Thank you, Richard. And then Lunama.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. I'm Loloma with ReNAPRI. My question is first to Moses, and it's following up on David's point. Is there a role for the private sector in helping design appropriate technology and helping with the adoption of that technology for farmers? Because we've seen some work that was done by John Deere, and I think they've been quite successful in that process in Tanzania and Zambia. Also, my second question is then for Flora, and it's a clarifying question. For the medium-scale farmers that are gaining access to that idle land, how many of them are starting from a smallholder base, or are these largely urban-based investor farmers?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I see that about half the questions are for Flora and the other half are for male members of the panel. Moses, you are in the hot seat. Civil society and its role in technology transfer. Is conservation agriculture opposed to sustainable intensification? Your best shot at these answers in 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think in addressing these questions, you have to look at the context of Zambia. Zambia has 75 million hectares of land. Only about 14% of such land is cropped in any one given year. So in terms of land, I think it's not that much of a challenge at the moment. If you look at countries like Malawi or indeed Western Kenya, I think land is such a challenge. And therefore, in such places, you have to look at intensification. Intensification can work as well in Zambia, but there's a role for conservation agriculture. I don't think there's any contradiction when you talk about land degradation and livestock, because obviously you just have to look at where exactly are you promoting these technologies. Livestock, like I said, conservation agriculture encourages crop management, but livestock also uses the same residues that you're supposed to use in conservation agriculture. So you need to target the technologies. In terms of appropriate and inappropriate technologies, again I said, if you are promoting liming in soils which are not acidic, what exactly are you doing? It's inappropriate. You have to take your soil tests. You have to know exactly what you are promoting. In terms of private sector involvement in developing appropriate technologies, the answer is yes. Small equipment, I think those can be designed by small private sector, and government needs to come in with incentives in terms of importing the appropriate materials that can then be used in the design of such equipment. Chair, I thank you.
Moses, I didn't think you fully answered the question about what kind of platforms are available for public sector research, for civil society organizations engaged in transfer, for private sector involved. What kind of platforms are available so that there's a kind of synergies are captured between each of these different partners? Could you address that question,
Yes,
please?
You know, government extension workers are widespread, but a private sector, sometimes they just go into specific areas. So what we are saying is that we need to ride on the government extension staff. So the civil society and private sector, as they come in to engage with the farmers, they need to all the time engage with the government extension officers, because these are widespread and they know the typologies that they are working in, and therefore you can also bring in the issue of innovation platforms within the given agroecology so that the technologies that are being promoted are cohesive, they are consistent, because sometimes a civil society will come in with what is not necessarily appropriate in that given agroecology, but the government extension officers are pretty aware about the prevailing circumstances there, the socio-economic and biophysical conditions.
Thank you, Moses. And when I get to Yemi, I'll ask him to also comment on this question through the innovation platforms. But Jean, would you mind now responding to the questions that you felt were appropriate for you? Thank you. 2 minutes, please.
Well, the one that was related somehow, the first question, I think, to the standard setting and how to actually help private sector, participate in markets and the standard setting compliance issue. I think yes, this is where I see a role for the public sector to accompany the private sector and to actually help them address the key challenges of the international markets, for example, demand, the global value chains, and to make sure that the number of mechanisms are put in place to accompany the private sector to actually, compete in the international market. Now, the issue of standard setting is also becoming a bit of a game of a jungle, because we see that is a bubble growing with a number of standards that are private standards that are largely competing and not necessarily bringing some clarity in the market. So I think one of the role of the government and the public sector is to bring transparency and try to put some discipline on how we use these standards and how this would better inform consumers and somehow deliver the expected premiums to producers.